A lot of people struggle with making websites responsive. It doesn't help that we're always given static designs and we're left to fill in the blanks, and it also doesn't help that it's hard to accommodate all the possible situations that we can run into. But based on my years of teaching and helping out people, I think one of the biggest problems is people make it a lot harder than it has to be. So in this video, I want to show you the easy way to do it. Hi there, my name is Kevin, and here at my channel, I mostly cover how awesome CSS is because I really think it's an amazing and underappreciated language. And I think that responsiveness is one of the many things that frustrates people, and it gives CSS a bad name. Now we're going to be doing this on a fairly simple layout so we can focus more on the ideas and not to have to, the video not for it to be too long. But at the end, I'm also going to talk about how these ideas can scale up into more complex sites. So let's go and dive in and take a look. So here is the design that we're going to be making, and we're going to be making this fully responsive, even though we only have a desktop website to be going off of. And so to be able to do that, the first thing is we do need to write some HTML first, right? Because we do need that. And I ran a poll recently just to see if people would be interested in having the HTML first, or if you just wanted to see the CSS for something like this, and you guys very much said that you'd want both the HTML and the CSS. So here we go. If you do want to skip ahead and only focus on the CSS part, there are timestamps down below, so you can skip to where I start writing CSS. And to start off with here, I am in VS Code, and in here we have Emmet already, so I can just do an exclamation point and hit tab, and I get a nice little starter here with most of the things that I'm going to need. And let's just put responsive made easy. Let's put a capital E for consistency. There we go. And we can jump on right away to our body here. And for the HTML itself, and you always have to be thinking about how you're going to structure things within your HTML and how to organize things. So the first thing is, obviously it's a bit of a simple design, but I always look at the desktop design when I'm writing my HTML because I need to see it in its most complex state, if you want to call it that. When we're creating this part of it, because it lets you organize, I need to know, am I using display flex here? Am I going to wrap that in something to use that display flex? Whereas if this was the desktop version, everything's just stacked up one on top of each other, it doesn't really tell you much. So let's go in here on my body, and we need this area here. We don't have anything too complicated, so I'm going to do a header up here at the top because it's the header of my site. And in my header, we'll do a paragraph with lorem 3. So this is Emmet if you're not used to it. So I'm saying lorem with 3 words inside of a paragraph. I hit tab and it does it for me. Look at that. It's not exactly the same text, but we're close enough. And then I want my H1, and I can just copy and paste this, I think. Let's see if this works. There we go. So responsive layouts don't have to be a struggle. There we go. Everything is looking good. I don't have word wrap on because I'm more worried about the structure right now rather than the text itself. So I just think it makes it a little bit easier to look at. If I find that we need to turn it off for something, I will do that though. So after that, we can come down over here. And for me, this is a section of content. It's another section in the site. So I'm going to write section. And let's hit inside my section. What do we have? We have 2 things. We have a heading. So I'm going to do an H2. And so that's my H2 right there. And then I have 2 columns over here. Okay, so for my 2 columns, I know that I need flexbox for that. So I'm going to do a div with a class of split on it because I'm splitting this into 2. And this split class could work with 3, 4, 5 columns. Anything like that would work. So I'm going to do a div class of split. And then in my split, I need 2 divs. So div times 2. And inside each one of those, or actually let's go back a step. We want a div times 2, and then inside each one of those will be a paragraph, and inside each paragraph we will have lorem, let's just say 25. So we end up with 2 paragraphs of about 25 words, give or take. And that's all done. So again, we have my H2, that's going to be quality designs. So we have my H2 here. Then I have my split class, which is going to wrap all of that. It's going to have a display flex on it to create 2 columns. And then this is 1 column and this is another. And you notice I'm not actually putting any class on here because I don't really think I need one. You could call it column, you could give it another name, but with how I'm going to be doing it, as long as I have a div in there or something to organize it, it's fine. In reality, I could do this even without these divs because it's 1 paragraph and 1 paragraph, but I sort of want to future-proof this a little bit just in case. What if this turned into 2 paragraphs? It would sort of cause things to break a little bit. So the idea here is that I can put as many paragraphs or other things in here and it would still work. And now these next two ones are actually very, very similar. I can come and say section. So actually, because they're so similar, why don't we do section times 2? Inside each one of the sections, we have a class of split. And inside my split, we will do 2 divs. And let's just hit tab and see what that gives us. So I have this one here and this one here. So then whoops, I made a mistake along the way, but that's okay. We can just duplicate that line. And I can duplicate that line there. So this time I'm organizing it a little bit differently because here I had a heading that I needed to go across the entire, it's spanning from one side to the other. Whereas here, this heading's not going across the whole top. It's actually aligning itself with over here. So in this case, my H2 would actually be inside this div. So we can do an H2 plus a paragraph. This text is a little shorter, so maybe we'll do a lorem 15. Made custom not just for you, for you. There we go. And so we get that text right there and my paragraph. And then down over here, I'm going to have my image. So in here, I do have an image folder, and in my image folder, I have a nicely named image1, and it could be, we can always put alt text on your images if they are part of the design or they are important. So it could be man standing on mountain edge looking at sunset. Now I can come down and we can look at this one. So this one's very similar, but it's the other way around. So my image would be first here. And so this is my image and my image 2. And in this case, it would just be mountains with sun setting behind them. Not exactly, but I think it's sort of, that orangey color. I think it gives it, and maybe, foggy mountains with sun setting behind them. And then over here, we could have my H2 as well as my paragraph with lorem 20. I did 29. That's okay. We have a bit of extra text. That's perfectly fine. Now, before I go to my CSS and start having the fun there, obviously this is a simple design. It has nothing complicated, but we'll play with it a little bit just to show you at the end how we can sort of manipulate this and do more with it. And if you're just wondering about these numbers, they're just going down for like the fonts and other things I'll be using over here. But what I want to sort of look at is, before we go further, you'll see I have different background colors on different areas here. And so I think what I'm going to do is come all the way up. And let's look at this and say, okay, my header has a background color on it. So you know what? Let's come here and say class is equal to, and let's give that a color. And I'm just going to check down here if I gave these colors names or not. No. Okay, so we'll call this BG light. This one I'm not going to bother, but you could say it's like a BG white if you wanted to. But I'm going to call that BG light. We'll call this one, that's my section here. So this one's going to get a class that is equal to BG dark. And this final one down here can be my class is equal to BG. I'm going to call it, just because this color is being reused, it's also the color I'm using for my titles. So I'm just thinking what I would call that color. And naming things is always super hard. But let's just say that's going to be my BG. Is it an accent color? We're going to go with accent. I know it's not much of an accent color, but that's going to be my accent color. Another thing is this text is going to be centered, and it's the only, this area does too. So what I'm going to do is, we need here too, whoops, just a little side thing, created with care. So we have text in there. If you notice, this is centered, but we have no other centered text right now. So I do think the easiest thing to do would be to create a little utility class. So on my header itself, I'm going to add a text center. And I'm going to use that on just my heading over here, text. Whoops, we need a class. Class is equal to text center. And the reason I like doing this and using a utility in this case is because it's sort of split amongst, and I could just do header, I could say header text align center and it works there, but having a utility class lets us move it around a little bit. And here I'm sort of taking advantage of inheritance because by putting it on the header, these are inheriting it and it's going to work on that. And then over here, I'm thinking the same. Here, I don't want it to be inherited. I only want to apply it to one thing. And it just makes it a little easier to select this H2 and to center align it rather than, saying if this was a section something that the heading in there, or, you start getting this weird complicated world sometimes and you get more complex than you have to. So for something simple like that, I think it works perfectly fine. And we might have to jump back up into the HTML. And as I said at the end, we will come in here and play around with it a little bit to look at how we can use this to make a more complex site, and it's still going to work really well. But just for now, I'm going to leave it like this. And if we need to come in to add a class or something like that, that would be fine with me, but I'm going to save it and leave it just like this. We do two other things though. So one of them is I am using Google Fonts here, and they are linked over. I have the description of them down at the bottom there. But what I'm going to do is I have them off screen over here, just so we don't have to go and find them on Google. And then the other thing that I need to add here is my actual link to my CSS. So we're going to say this is link and CSS. And in this case, it's in a folder called CSS, and then I called it main. So we'll just change that style to main.css. And I'm going to be using live server for this. So this is an extension in VS Code. So I'm going to just click this go live here, and it should open it up for Firefox for me. And this is just a nice thing to get like the immediate changes. So if I make a change here, we'll see that change happen live in the browser over here. And so let's jump over to the main, and I'm going to do a few things at the beginning here. I just want to be able to see my colors and my fonts. And what I want to do at the very beginning, you'll notice my CSS, I have a little bit set up here, not very much, but I've just removed my margins and we don't need this. There we go. I was copying it from something that had auto prefixer on it, so I had the prefix. But we get this just to set my border box to box sizing and just resetting my margins here. So nothing too fancy. And then what I want to do is I'm going to come in here and the first thing actually is I want to set up a few custom properties. And if you don't know about custom properties, they are absolutely amazing. So I'm going to select my root, which is where we typically put our custom properties. And let's set up some colors first. So I'm going to have a color, I'm going to call it a color. This goes a little bit against how I usually call things. Or you know what? I know what we'll do. We'll do a color of primary 300, which will actually be this light one. And maybe this is somewhere where I might have another step in between them usually. But it is what it is. We have a pretty limited color palette here. And we'll do a color of primary 400. Whoops. 400, and that one will be this darker brown right here. And I'm doing this because they're sort of, shades of each other. So we're going to do it like that. And then I'm going to have a color. It's not really a neutral, but I'm still going to go with a neutral. And it's really dark, so I don't think we'd get darker than this. So I'm going to call it 900. And so my naming convention here is just like, it's sort of based like with font weights. If you go font weights, the bigger the number, you go towards the thicker fonts, and the higher the number, or the smaller the number, the more thin the font is. So in this case, I'm doing something similar, but it's going from light to dark. So you know what, this could actually be like a 200, and this would probably be like a 500, but whatever, that'd be my neutral. So this is like always my base one. I'm putting a space in between these two just to say if this project were to get bigger, I could have another shade of that brownish color in between the two. And then here I'm also going to have a color neutral 100, which almost always for me is white, but if ever you have a project where it's not actually a white that you're using, it's just a really simple, it's a barely off white, I think it makes sense to have something like that set up. And again, if you don't know about custom properties, it makes it easier to get your colors than having to remember these, but it also makes things really easy to change in the future. So let's go back to Firefox and see what we have. Okay, actually we should set up our fonts as well. So I'm going to do that, just font family. We'll do primary, and primary is going to be Roboto sans serif, and my font family accent. And you could say this is like heading, play, fair, display. I'm pretty sure I don't have, and this would be a serif. I don't have Google Fonts open, so hopefully those work. But I'm doing primary and accent just because the primary, it's being used in the most places. And then I have a little accent font to add some flair to my headings and maybe in some other places. But this could easily be like body and heading or, something like that, depending on how it's used. The problem with saying like font family heading is then when you start using it in places that aren't headings, it seems kind of weird sometimes, but it's really up to you and how you want to name things. And then we can come over here and we can style my body a little bit. So body. I already have my body with a margin of 0 on this reset. So here I'm just going to say that my font family is my font family primary, because that's what's being used in all my paragraphs and everything. And we want my font weight. Actually, I think it is it 400 or 300? There we go. I think 300 is what I used. Did I say here? Regular. I used regular. Okay, we'll stick with 400 then. And the font size is going to be, I use 21 pixels. That comes out to 1.3125 rem. And I do we're talking about responsiveness. Ideally, you're not setting your font sizes in pixels. I would set them in rem. If you're not used to M and rem, I do have a couple of videos on those, so I'll link those down in the description below. So there we go, that's set that. And I'm also going to boost my line height because the default line height is always very high on that. We hit save, and there we go, we can get off and running. Cool. I'm going to move this off screen actually, but I will move it back on screen whenever there's something important that I need to look at or anything like that. But I've also linked the GitHub repo down below, and that includes this PDF. So if you'd like to have it as reference while I'm going through the video, that option is there for you. So what do we want to do here? So the first thing is I'm going to set up some of the utility classes that I created first. So the first thing, we had all of my, so we have different types of utility classes. I have some that are for like the split, which is going to split things in half. And then I have other ones that are doing a few other things, and actually a few other things before we even get to that. H1, H2, H3. I'm just going to put a line height on these, line height of 1, because, let's bring this back on, this is really close together. And in general, that's, the 1.6 on the headings is going to be a bit too much. And at the same time, font family, and in this case, it's going to be the accent. So if I hit save, we should see those switch. The only weight I think I brought in for those is the font weight of 900, but I'm going to set it anyway, just to make sure that we're getting the right font weight on those. And font weight and other things like the font sizes, you could also definitely create custom properties for, but we'll keep it as simple as we can for this video. So that's set up. Now we can come in and always do typography first. And we're going to see that not only doing typography first, we're going to do other things. Let's set up my background classes. I need a dot for that. So BG, we can say BG light is and I'll just do these, actually I have prettier on, so it's going to switch it anyway, but background, and I'm going to do background color, because for utility classes, I tend to find it's a better idea, just in case you try something a little bit different. Maybe we could see that a little bit later on. But let's say we say a background color of, I don't want that, I want my vars. And so which one was it? This is my light. My light would be this one. So actually we need a light, we need the accent. I'm going to duplicate that 2 times there. And then we're just going to say this one is my BG primary. And then this one is my BG dark. And then we'll just make these changes here. So this would be my neutral 900. And then my background color here would be that's my primary, would be the primary. I think we called it, we stuck with 400, eh? I thought about changing it, but we didn't. So you can actually see that background color has come in over there. My primary, oh, I didn't spell dark right. With a K, with a K, with a K, there we go, that one worked. And did I make a mistake when I did that last one? BG dark, oh, I said accent. We're gonna call it BG primary then, because I changed my mind a little bit on how we'd name things. Great. So, I mean, it's not fantastic yet, but we have something coming together, right? So we have some things coming together. Now, sometimes with utility classes like this, we're only going to set the background colors, and then you'll use other things to change the font colors. But you know what? I'm growing more of the mind that even though this is like a utility class, it's only doing one thing and one thing only. If you have this dark background, you probably have specific colors that you're using on top of it. So I think, personally, it's perfectly fine. My background light, by the way, I think is fine. But my background, let's just go look at these two. For both of these, I think it's perfectly fine to say that here, the color is going to be my var color neutral 100, and we can just copy that line and put it on this one as well. So if you like the idea more of it like a utility class to also set the font color overall, instead of setting, writing the code twice, that's fine, and I get it. But sometimes I don't mind doing this, and then it also makes it so if you do need to change them, you can. Another thing that some people might not like the idea of, but I'm going to do ABG primary, comma, primary H2, and this could even be like an H1 and your H2 and your H3. Depending on how you're setting things up. But I'm going to do my primary and my BG dark, H2, and we're going to say that the color on those is my var. It was this one here, which is that light brownish color. Oh, whoop, this shouldn't be my primary light. This should be my dark here. There we go. So you can see this one has changed and this one has changed color. And while, some people don't like this idea of using these types of selectors, I think for a utility class like this, where everywhere in your design, that's what's happening, it's not the end of the world. If you don't like this idea of using a compound selector here, instead of that, you could come up with a utility class that's like, you could use a text light, a text light, and then you're setting the same color, and then you're just adding that. I like having a lot of my CSS in the CSS, and what I mean, I like having CSS that's doing this type of job rather than adding utility classes everywhere. I think utility classes are super useful, but I try and find a certain balance, but everybody has a different balance that they're comfortable with. Some people like the atomic style or like tailwind style, and other people like me prefer having more in the CSS, and I was a big BEM user, and I still am heavily influenced by BEM, where you might not have any utility classes. So there's a bit of a to and fro that goes on with these types of things. So let's keep going, and you might be going right now, but Kevin, you haven't talked about responsiveness yet. Don't worry, we're getting there. But another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up all the way to here actually and do a section selector. And on the section, I'm going to add some spacing. And so let's do some, and by spacing, I mean padding. So we're going to add padding top and bottom. And let's start with, I'm just looking at that design. Did I say how much spacing we need? Oh, I have a typo there. No, okay, so we're good. So I'm just going to say padding here is going to be, we're going to start we'll start with 3 rem, top and bottom, and we'll do a 0 left and right like that. And you can see that gives me spacing on the top and bottom. Now, I know there's a little white square around my images. I just had some issues exporting them from Figma that I can't figure out how to get rid of it. I don't know what I did, but that's okay. I could crop it off in Photoshop or dive more into Figma, but so that's working there. And then right now there is the other issue of it's stuck to the side of the screen. So there are a few different approaches you could take for this. There's actually ways of doing this without a container, but I think I am going to come in and wrap everything in a container. And this is something I tend to not, I always forget to do it. Early on, it's just, a little mistake that I do often, because when I'm looking at it, I'm not thinking containers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything here. I'm going to do a shift command and a P. And I'm going to choose emit wrap with abbreviation. And if you don't see that, you can just start writing emit and it's going to show up there, emit wrap with abbreviation. And I can do dot container and hit enter, and it's wrapped it in my container like that. And then we can do the same thing on this one, shift command P, dot container. And then we can do the same thing over here, select that one, shift command P, wrap dot container. And there we go. And now I can set up my container. And I'll do that here with my sections. So we have a dot container. And again, this is a bit of a utility class. So it's doing one thing and one thing only. So I'm gonna say that my margin is a 0 auto. Or you know what we could do? We could use a margin inline here, which is interesting, of auto. And so a margin inline would be your left and your right margins only. This is part of the newer CSS syntax of, this is part of the newer CSS, which is looking at logical properties. So this, you can do margin and padding as inline elements, and I think borders have it as well. So you have margin inline is left and right, and then the margin block would be your top and bottom. But this also can shift around a little bit depending on the writing mode that's being used. So if you have a right to left language, it shifts things around, or if you had a vertical language, it can shift things around a little bit automatically without you having to make any adjustments. And to keep pushing newer CSS and have a little bit of fun with newer CSS, I'm going to do a width. And we're going to set a min value on this. So the minimum is going to be, let's say 90%, comma, and in the design I did have a specific value of 70.5 as the maximum width that we should put. And so if we go and take a look, we should see that it works here. But if we go at smaller screens, and this is the responsive mode in Firefox, and Chrome has one too. In Firefox, it's a Shift-Control-M to open it. If you're in Chrome, it's the same shortcut, but only if you're in your DevTools. But you can see at large screen sizes, it stops growing. And then at small screen sizes, we have the padding, or that 90%, so it's keeping things off the side a little bit. So I find that super useful, and I'm actually going to stay at small screens now because I'm worrying about the mobile design first. So this is the same as setting width 90% and then max width of 70.5. And if you'd like to know more about min, I do have a video on it. And once again, that will be linked in the description down below, where I looked at the min, max, and clamp values, and they're super useful and super fun for making websites. But there we go. So that's working, and we have that. So awesome. This is all good. Super duper. Look at that. Everything is starting to come together. We never did my text center. So let's move this. That's my background. This is all sort of layouty stuff here. So I'm going to actually go right here and do my text center. So my text center will be a text align. Whoops, not last, just text align center. And there we go, that's centered. And I realized I did one thing that I should have done everywhere. This should be also my header and my section. So there we go, we get something like that. For this case, just because it's narrower, we could have like a modified narrow header, because if we come and look, container I should say, if we look at the design, this area is much narrower than over here. So we could do that, or you could just put in like a break after don't. The issue with using BRs is it will work at one screen size. So if we put our BR in there for a break, it's working here because, you know, everything looks perfect now. But then when I get to this size, all of a sudden, like, it's not terrible. But you get this point where don't ends up on its own line, which I don't think is very ideal. And it could be even worse depending on the rest of the content that's in there. So, you know, it depends on your choices here and what you want to do. But to me, it makes sense to actually come in here. We could do a wrap with Emmet again. And so I'm going to put a container, and you could either do two things. If this is something that's reappearing in a lot of places on your site, you could have a container and then have a modifier class on that that's setting the width to be a little bit smaller maybe. So like a container and then a container narrow. And the other option is to say that your header container is smaller. But it depends on how you want to do, how you see your project evolving over time. I'm going to do this one because I do think that it allows for more modification over time. And this double hyphen, it allows for further growth if your project keeps growing, so you can use a narrow container if ever you need one. And I'm also going to, this double hyphen that's here is just sort of a remnant of how I do BEM. So it's saying I'm using my container, but I'm just making a modification to something on it. So let's hit save, and let's come over to here, and where I had my container, we could just say that my container narrow has a max width, and instead of 70 rem, it could be 50 rem. And you know what, 50 is a little bit, let's bring that even down even more, 40 rem, even less, 30, we're getting pretty small here, there we go. 35 is probably roughly where we want to be on this one, 34, 35, there we go. So we get this narrower one, and it is, look at that, it's all working, it's staying small there, and it's getting a little bit, or it's not getting bigger, it's doing what we want it to do here. So perfect, it's just setting a max width, we don't get those weird line breaks because we don't have a BR in there, and everything just sort of works. And we're getting our padding that we had set originally, or not our, but we get that min value is still coming in where the content won't actually touch the side. So super cool that it sort of all works in conjunction, and we're sort of just layering things on top a little bit by doing this. Now, a lot of the time for my spacing, I took all my spacing off, and this is how I usually work. So I'm not going to dive into my usual answer on how I do things because it's a little bit out of scope for this tutorial itself. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on my, I'm just going to add a margin bottom. So we've taken the margins off everything. So on these, I'm going to say they all have a margin bottom of 1em, which means the margin will be roughly equal to, or will be actually equal to their actual font size. So that gives us our space right there. It gives us a little bit of spacing. And then on my paragraphs, we could do the same thing actually. Why don't we do it again? I don't always work this way, but for simplicity's sake right now, we only need it on my H2 actually. H2, I don't have any H3s, but since, you know, I wrote H3 and maybe our project would expand. that it could be useful to have them. And we'll just say a margin bottom of 1em, just so we can keep focusing more on the responsive side of things. So we have the margin adding here. It's giving us all the spacing that I think we need throughout everything. Maybe there's an argument that my images should have something just because it's a little bit stuck there. And overall, things are actually working really well on the mobile point of view now. Like, I haven't done any layout stuff yet. I haven't created my flexbox to make my I haven't done anything. All I've done is add in a few things. I've added padding for spacing. I've added a container just to keep content off the side of my screen. And I've set up my fonts and, extra spacing. The only thing that's broken right now are my images, because here they're overflowing out the side and they're actually causing some side scrolling, which is not ideal. So the last thing I'm going to do is to come in and say that my images should have a max width of 100%, which should be something you do on every project. And another thing that can help is just to throw a display block on there, which is something that I do most of the time. It does have some consequences, but I find it outweighs the side effects. So at large screens, the images will not stretch because it's a max width of 100%. It just means that they'll shrink if the area is too small. And just like that, we have our layout is coming together. It's not amazing, but it's working at small screens without very much work. And then what we can do is when we get to the larger screen sizes, that's when we want these two columns to kick in. So this is one of the reasons, as much as possible, I'm going to advocate, and this is the whole responsive made easy, is do the basic design stuff first. Look at the big picture and work your way in first of all. So when I'm looking at this, when I write the HTML, I need to worry about my layout. When I start writing the CSS, I'm worried about my colors, my fonts, my global styles as much as possible, start adding utility classes in to style things up as much as possible, and then you start adding complexity within media queries. I have talked about this before, and some people have said, well, with a navigation or with there are some things that are more complicated at small screens than big screens, and that's fine. You can add that complexity through media queries and use a max width. But I think 95% of the time, a min width media query is where you're going to go because you're adding the complexity as you get to the larger screen sizes. And again, a few things that I've done here, my section and my header padding has been the same throughout everything. So I'm worried about it looking good at small screens, making sure that everything is working. And actually, I just realized my H1 is the wrong color as well. And my heading here is the wrong color, so we could fix those just really fast by saying that their color is my color, this one right there, right? So those will switch. These ones won't because we overwrote those with more specific selectors that are lower down. So that would work. And even if this was just like a utility class, it would still, it's higher specificity, so it would still work and it would still overwrite things. So there we go. It's working at small screens really well. And I haven't had to do anything. I've just styled the basic styling of it. And then when we get to the larger screens, this is when we need to add some complexity. As I said at the start, I realize that this is taking a look at a very simple site. But before I talk about the ideas how this can be scaled up more, I just want to let you know that this was actually a project for my free course, Conquering Responsive Layouts. It's a 21-day drip course, and the first week about it is about thinking responsively and using responsive units. The second week, we're looking at Flexbox, and in the third week, we're exploring media queries. It's 100% free, and the link to join is just down below. So I'm going to stick up here with these, my container, and we had my split. So my split, what I want it to do is a display of flex. And if I do that, everything becomes two columns. Fantastic. But you can see there's a few issues here. So the first is we have two columns everywhere, which we don't want. Okay, so what we can do is you have two choices here. One is if you want the power of Flexbox everywhere, is you could come in and say that the flex direction is row, or not row. I always mix that up when I want to set them column. And that way it goes back to normal more or less. And this would be really useful if you did reset your margins, because if not, you end up with double spaced margins because you have no more collapsing margins. I personally like this approach because I like having Flexbox whenever possible because you can do extra stuff with it that you can't without Flexbox. So I do like this idea of just sort of resetting things back this way and then coming in and saying inside my media query. So we'll do a min width of, I'm just going to guess at a number and we can always modify that number after. And again, I'm not using pixels. I am using M here. If you're more comfortable using pixels, that's perfectly fine. M are more consistent between browsers when people are zooming in and out. There's an article by Zell that's really old but still applies, so you can check that out in the description below if you want more information on that. So in here I can say that my split is going to have a flex direction of, now I want the row. So when we pass that media query, we jump into having 2 columns. So just like that, then we get to 2 columns like that. There's still a few other issues though. Right now, the images are even different sizes, and this is, I want everything to be equal in here. So one thing I always do with my split class inside my, like when I have the flex direction row, and this is for equal columns. As long as you want equal columns, this will work. What I do is my split, split, and then all the direct children of my split will have a flex basis of 100%. And just like magic, everything becomes equal width. So nice, so easy. If you don't know about flex basis, it's sort of like it's saying the ideal width that you want something to be. And because both of them want to be 100%, they both want to be the same size. Flex is going to shrink them down to make them fit into columns because it's a flex direction of row, and it just makes it balances them out because they're both supposed to be the same size. They're both supposed to be 100. Flex needs to shrink them to make everything work because the default for flex is that things are allowed to shrink, and they always shrink at the same. They're both set anyway by default to have a shrink of the same rate, so they end up being the same size. And then we hit our media query, and they stack one on top of each other. Cool, right? I think that's pretty cool. And then we do need the space in between because it's obviously ugly when things are stuck. I really like using the gap property for this, but it is not available in Safari, so I'm not going to dive into it. But once again, I have a video that takes a look at it if you're interested in that. But what we can do instead of that, I'm going to stay with my media query, is I'm going to stick with these interesting ones. So it's split, and I'm going to say star, in this case, plus, star plus star, and I'll explain this in a second. And we're going to say margin left is whatever we want our gap to be, 2em. And that will put a 2em space between all of our columns like that. So this is the adjacent sibling selector. So it's saying any sibling that has a sibling before it is, or not, any element that has a sibling before it. So here we have an element, we have a div that's here, and then before it, it has another div. Does this have a div before it? No, it just has its parent. So in that case, it doesn't get a margin added to the left. Same thing here. There's a div here. It has something before it, so it creates that gap. So that can be really useful. Just make sure that is in your media query so it's not being applied, because if I put this out here, you'll see that now we get a margin in areas where we don't want a margin. So it is important that does end up in your media query. There we go. And just like that. I guess one other thing actually we could do is on my section here and on my header, I'm going to copy this, and we could say at media min width of 40em to stay consistent with our other one. And we could on this one say that my padding is going to go up quite a bit bigger, let's say 7, just so at larger screens we have a bit more breathing room and it matches the design a little bit. And so here it looks really good, and we get to there. Because you're on a phone, maybe this could be boosted a little bit, but you need less room because we have less room to work with in a smaller space. We don't want too much breathing room or it just looks empty. But when you have a nice big screen and you have that room to play with, we might as well take advantage of it. And just like that, we start getting this very simple layout coming together. So it is simple, I won't lie to you, but it's very robust too, because as simple as it looks, I could come in here and I could add another section right here. And look at that, I have a 3-column section and it's working perfectly fine. And it's going to work here, it's going to shrink down, it's going to switch over on my columns. My breakpoint might be a little bit narrow here because those lines of text are getting mighty tiny. So that might need some tweaking, but you get the idea. I could do that. I could even make that 4 columns. I could come on here and we could add some paragraphs, and that column is just going to stretch out and it's going to work. We can copy that, add a whole nother div. We get 4 columns. So this isn't perfect because it is set up completely for having equal columns. So there might be other solutions to other ways. And again, even here, if we wanted to, we could let's just take this one right here, and I could throw that here, and we could put it before the first one in this one. And just like that, you get 3 columns like this. You get an image column there, another one there, and again, it splits and then it falls like that, and then it comes back this way. So, you know, it's not set up right now for columns that are not equal. It's set up to work for what we have, but it's easy enough to come up with other patterns like this that could work and make it functional with different sets of columns, with different sizes of columns and all of that. It's not that much more work to keep pushing this. And I really think the easiest way to always make any layout and any pattern and any design and any element that you're making is look at the HTML, I was looking here, I have a webcam here and I have this here, so I was looking at my webcam there. It's kind of funny. But the easiest thing to do is to look at the desktop version or the most complex version when you're writing your HTML. Then when you're writing your CSS, you don't worry about that at all. You just worry about your colors, a little bit of like padding top and bottom to add some spacing, and then you just keep going. And then you use your media queries to add complexity. Because if you're when you start overwriting a lot of things in your media queries, it's like, what did I overwrite? What else do I need to overwrite? And you start running into a bit of a battle. Whereas if you're adding complexity through that, it's always going to be easier. And it's always easier if you're looking at the big picture. So for big picture here, what I mean by that is what I did from the very beginning is I took a look at how I could set this up in a way that's like, oh, I have 2 columns here, 2 columns here, and 2 columns here. I'm going to use the same class for all of that. I see so many people who will design this and then code that. They'll do the HTML for this, then they'll do the CSS for that. Then they'll do the same thing here. Then they'll do the same thing here. And then once again, they'll do the same thing down there again. And it just they start repeating themselves so much that the code becomes a bit of a mess. It becomes a lot harder to maintain. So I think any web design, not just responsive design made easy, is by doing that approach to it, of looking at the big picture and then getting narrower, focusing on the smaller details as you go in and adding complexity a little bit where you need to. And the same thing with the media queries and all of that. If you need 2 columns, or if you need to add, make some interesting things happen only at larger screens, add that in afterward. Do the base styling first, get everything working, and then start adding in the complexity as you need to. Now for this site, did you realize something? I only had a desktop design. One of the things I hear all the time is that people code desktop first because that's what they're given. And fair enough, I understand that gives you that, so you're thinking that way first. But as we saw in this video, by starting with all the things like color, typography, just spacing things out, and then adding the complexity, it makes it pretty easy to work mobile first, even if the designs that you have are the desktop ones. And before there's comments about it, I know that some people are building web apps that are only intended to be visited on desktop computers. And if that's the case, and that's what you need, well, obviously that's the case, and we're not even talking about responsive design anyway in those cases. So I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts about responsive design, do leave them down in the comments below. And of course, if you are interested in my Conquering Responsive Layouts course, the link for it is down below. You can get more information on it through that link and sign up for it 100% free down there as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this one. A massive thank you to my patrons for their support each and every month. You guys are the absolute best. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.